I am rather delighted to have been given this opportunity to, in a way, make my statement on this very important topic. And I want to start by saying that not very long ago, I had cause to read an extraordinarily brilliant and brutally frank piece from one Nobel laureate, Peace Prize winner, Oscar Arias, and President of Costa Rica, reminding Latin Americans that they must look in the mirror and confront the reality that the many problems like inequality, crime, and environmental degradation do not lie in their stars, but in themselves. Only when they would have confronted this reality would Latin America attain the development it has so long sought. In that piece titled Culture Matters, the Real Obstacles to Latin American Development, he mentioned how Latinos are prone to not applying and enforcing the huge amount of studies they conduct and laws they pass. Agreeing with another president of Latin America, President Osvaldo Hurtado of Ecuador, he stated, "Our legislatures have probably passed more laws over the past 175 years than their counterparts anywhere in the world. Yet never have so many laws been ignored by so many for so long." Does that analysis ring a bell? Actually, I think it does. We in the Caribbean region, Caricom more specifically, have been smitten by the same culture bug, as it were. Crime and violence, especially at the youth level, are two major enemies of our people. They are substantially internally caused and rooted. We have had scores of studies done on them and a mighty lot of laws passed. Yet somehow they still loom large, so large we sometimes want to surrender to them. And so on this occasion I want to highlight some of these major reports which would have examined youth crime and violence in the Caricom region over the years. I do not want to go back for too long a period, but to start is from 2006, when the United Nations report on violence against children in the Caribbean was done, and which documents the findings of youth violence in 16 Caribbean countries. It studied the workplace, the homes, the families, schools, institutions, community, even street life, and it reports a high number of children in our Caribbean territories witnessing violent acts at some point in their lives, seeing high levels of violence in schools and communities and so on. But the main message of that report is that no violence is justifiable and all forms of violence against children and young people are preventable. To this end, a number of recommendations, including the enactment of legislation, policy framework, strategies and interventions were proposed. Then there was, after 2006, another 2007 report, Crime, Violence and Development, Trends and Policy Options in the Caribbean. And this was done by the World Bank in collaboration with UNODC. This one reports the high incidence of crime and violence in the region and identifies illicit drugs and narcotics trafficking as the underlying cause, and forecasting the implications for development. It draws attention to the tendency of states to rely overly on the criminal justice system and the criminal justice approaches to crime reduction, while neglecting other complementary and more effective preventative approaches in reducing certain types of crime and violence. It examines and provides insights on the central role of government of member states of the Caribbean Community must play in the prevention and reduction of crime and violence. Specifically, the report recommends that in addressing issues of youth violence, quote, policymakers in the short run should borrow from the toolkit of evidence-based programs from other regions. And these must include early childhood development and mentoring programs, interventions to increase retention of high-risk youth in secondary schools, and opening schools after hours and on weekends to attract activities to occupy their free time. We at our cabinet only too recently had our attention brought to the benefits of early childhood development, where the evidence from a neuroscience symposium in New York 2014 clearly indicate that forming relationship from birth to 3 years by parents of the child, what is called bonding, is most critical for cognitive, social, and emotional development, which then lasts a lifetime, and which, this is important, if not done, can result in a neglected child and a child more prone to deviant behavior later in life. We have to, as I will come to some other reports, but on that one, have to pay strong attention there in relation to early childhood development. Then there is a third one. It's called the 2010 UNDP Citizen Security Survey, which revealed 6 patterns in the incidence of youth violence in the Caribbean as follows. Youth violence and crime has a gender dimension. Violent acts are mainly carried out by young males against other young males, and of course too against females, where the main victims are in situations of domestic abuse and sexual assault. And then there has been an increase in violence, that survey found, among pre-adolescents in the Caribbean, all the territories of the Caribbean. There has been also an increase in school violence. Violence was mainly used out of fear or in response of a perceived threat. Another one that they found was youth violence that's closely associated with violence in the community. And victimization of youth by peers and adults often leads to more violence. Now, in relation to that number one that was found in the survey, gender dimension of youth violence, I want to make a comment here. And I think you would, Mr. Dr. Slater, allow me, as one who have read the reports, to say that in our Caribbean territory there is a certain machismo of our boys which violates the equality we spout for our girls, which we in the Caribbean somehow find acceptable, this machismo. We have to drastically change this culture of our boys, otherwise it makes it harder for them to become men. Our girls will always become women, leaving them back if we continue that kind of attitude. And this shift must see our men showing our boys that they are parents and not providers, that they must exhibit a culture of care and companionship rather than control. We have also a fourth report, Eye on the Future, Investing in Youth Now for Tomorrow's Community, in the same year, 2010, as that survey was conducted. And this report articulated the voices of youth and noted that crime and violence was the number one concern among adolescent and youth in the Caribbean community. It has been associated with poverty, unemployment, politics, and social inequities. Constant exposure to crime and violence leads to emotional blunting, high stress, grief, and a sense of loss. Young people across the region spoke of fear, perceptions of lack of safety concerns, diminished participation in community activities, restriction on nighttime activities, and changes in social practice as a consequence. They also wondered about the quality of life facing them. And on that score, my reading of The Economist, and I plucked it out because I had remembered it for this occasion, The Economist of January 23rd this year, 2016, talking about the millennial generation, in which there is a beautiful article there. The world's young are an oppressed minority. Unleash them. That's probably where I got that from, unleashing them. And yes, it is indeed stated therein that the older, meaning people like myself, have a role to play in relation to unleashing this oppressed minority, as it were. And it goes on to say that we sometimes do not, as that report mentioned, we do not seek to have their talent purposefully directed for the development of our Caribbean territories. Now, it didn't say about Caribbean territories. It was a larger article dealing with South Korea and India and China. But the same thing applies here. And so I want us to take the lesson of especially that Eye on the Future report. That report was very important to the extent that the Paramaribo Declaration on the Future of Youth in the Caribbean Community then made certain declarations and endorsement of the recommendations of that same Eye on the Future report. In the Declaration of Paramaribo, issued at the conclusion of the summit in that year, then declared, acknowledged the corrosive impact of crime and violence, poverty, social inequalities, and marginalization on adolescent and youth health and well-being, and the impact of globalization on our traditional values. And I'm glad that indeed the heads of government saw it fit to make that endorsement flowing out of that report. Now, from all these surveys and reports, and even local and wider international studies, we know quite a lot, especially about families and children and violence. And I want to say, it is not over our heads that while many aggressive children in the Caribbean go on to be law-abiding adults, aggression at a young age significantly predicts violent convictions later on, well into the 30s. It is not over our heads that most children who have been physically abused by parents and others go on to live perfectly normal adult lives. Yet we know physical abuse doubles the risk that a boy, especially a boy, will have convictions for violent crime as an adult. It is not over our heads that failure of a child in school is one of the most enduring correlates of later violence. 4 out of 5 violent offenders in the Georgetown and the prisons in and around Guyana, my prison director has estimated 4 out of 5 violent offenders never finished high school. It is not over our heads that lack of parental supervision has been consistently related to delinquency, and violent delinquency at that. And so with all these reports, and with all that does not pass over our heads, we have to ask the question, or it must be put, what is to be done? Though we know plenty, we certainly do not know nearly enough as to how to prevent violence and youth crime in the first place, nor how to stop it happening when it begins. But we can learn more if we can do a couple of things. One, we have to make a long-term investment in national research and development in youth crime and violence. Two, we have to continue efforts like this of having a coherent and coordinated Caricom regional strategy for identifying the interventions needed. Three, we have to institute a program of rigorously evaluating these interventions to see what works and what does not. We need to make a national and regional commitment to understand the causes of youth violence and crime. Then after that, we must make the political commitment to procure the resources, train the brigade, and to go get the recommendations implemented, to walk the talk, as it were. So if indeed gun crimes continue to saturate the regional crime landscape, and limiting the availability of guns will help, why should there not be an amnesty, and even, as was done recently by my government, jacking up licensing fees as a start to make it all the more difficult to get? So if indeed there is a correlate between alcohol and violence, and there is no dispute about this, why should we not implement a curfew to stem the binges our society indulge in after 2 a.m. generally? And so too must we not be afraid of addressing violence in school settings. If legislation enabling corporal punishment is to be reviewed, then so be it. If we have to practice a quality of community policing, which brings problem-oriented policing that promotes trust and collaboration, then let it be done. If risk factors and vulnerabilities associated with youth crime and violence must be dealt with, like marginalization, school dropout rates, then we must find the monies. We must find the monies to effect the remedies to these problems. And we must immediately start prioritizing the programming for these. If juvenile justice reform is needed, we must legislate as early as possible for those reforms. So, coming back to my original point that President Arias made, we have to shift away from that culture that he spoke about. We must start enforcing the law and implementing the recommendations of the studies, the many measures that will deal with for care and supervision of our young, for education and vocational training of our young, so that our children can be in schools and not jails. The leadership demanded, and this I want to address what Astel mentioned just now, of us in the Caribbean, from us politicians, business, labor, religious leaders, civil society generally, is to lose our fear of change, to embrace trust, to conceive of smart public policy, and after the conception of them, the execution forthwith, and not to be uncertain, not to act with hesitation. Our capacity as a people to sort things out, such as youth crime and violence, though deeply conditioned by historical legacies and socioeconomic structures and even culture, is also a product of political crafting. There isn't anything in this world that cannot be crafted to end the youth violence or to bring it down to lower rates. We, notwithstanding, as President Arias made mention of, culture deficits, we can also, by a political crafting, set to correct that. We therefore must craft a character and a culture here in the Caribbean that will make assets out of our young people rather than liabilities. This forum, which brings together a variety of stakeholders in relevant sectors, is a wonderful exercise as to what we must be doing. It should be replicated at the community and national levels, more not only to address this issue of youth crime and violence, but to ensure Caricom and regional integration is brought more to the ground in the various territories that comprise Caricom. This initiative is a good example of the value of regional cooperation in addressing an issue which threatens our development and our future. I consider this opportunity to address you as extremely fortunate, as it happens as a result of substituting for another minister who was supposed to be here and to give the original presentation. I am indeed happy and honored to have been allowed to make this statement on this important issue. I wish the forum enlightened deliberations in the following days and successful outcomes which will enrich us all. Thank you, and God bless.